I'm Jay Bryson, the Chief Economist of the Corporate and Investment Bank at Wells Fargo, and I'm joined today with my colleague, Michael Pugliese, and we're going to talk about our outlook for fiscal policy. So, Mike, President Biden recently gave a pretty important speech in Pittsburgh. What did he say?
Yeah, so last week, President Biden and his administration laid out a 2.25 trillion infrastructure package that was primarily focused on physical infrastructure areas. And so this included a pot of money for roads, bridges, airports, public transit, water and power infrastructure, and then it expanded a little bit further into electric vehicle infrastructure and expanding access to long-term care for the elderly and other groups. It involved some research and development areas, manufacturing. And so in total, this was about 2.25 trillion, was mostly for physical infrastructure to be spent over the next several years to even up to a decade and more.
Okay, hold on a second, Mike. You just said $2.25 trillion. The number that I had heard that was being bandied about before all of this was closer to 3 trillion. So is this smaller than what we had expected?
Yeah, so the plan, as we understand it, is the Biden administration will have a second proposal out sometime later this month. And that proposal will come on the heels of the first plan, the American Jobs Plan that we were just discussing. And so the second proposal might include some more areas along social policies like federal paid family leave or universal pre-K, free community college, possibly extending the expanded child tax credit that was just done for 1 year under the American Rescue Plan. And while we don't have all the details yet, our guess is if those types of policies are included roughly along the lines that we're anticipating, that could add another $1 to $2 trillion on top of the $2.25 trillion American Jobs Plan that was announced at the end of March.
Okay, so we're talking 2 trillion or so, and let's call it hard infrastructure. We're talking 1 to 2, and we'll call it soft sort of infrastructure. Total we're looking at $3 to $4 trillion. I mean, that's a lot of money, right? Did the president say anything about how he proposed to pay for all of that?
So in that $2.25 trillion American Jobs Plan, the Biden administration did propose some tax increases to help pay for this proposal. And what they proposed was primarily on the corporate income tax side. So the biggest proposed change was taking the corporate income tax rate up to 28% from the 21% that has prevailed since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017. And there were some other changes as well that predominantly are around taxing international profits from abroad. So raising the GILTI rate, for example, from about 10.5% to 21%. A couple other changes like instituting a 15% minimum tax on book income. But in total, kind of the idea here is that the plan will be paid for with corporate income taxes that over a decade raise probably somewhere around $1 to $1.5 trillion. So they don't necessarily pay for the package in full, but some of this proposed infrastructure spending is one-off, so it's not a recurring cost over time. Whereas the Biden administration has proposed making these corporate income tax increases permanent, such that over time more and more revenue would be raised, the spending would fall off, and the plan would come into balance and potentially even become deficit reducing over the long run.
Okay, so I heard you talk a lot about corporate taxes and how maybe everything's not completely paid for, but you didn't mention anything there about personal taxes. Is there anything here for individuals?
Yeah, so the individual taxes we suspect will be key to paying for the second half of the plan that we anticipate being proposed later this month. And so on the personal income tax side, there are a few changes we think are fairly likely to make it into that plan. So one would be reinstituting the top marginal income tax rate at 39.6%, which would be up from 37% and back to that 39.6% that was in effect before the 2017 tax cuts. And that would probably go into effect around the level of 400,000 or so for that top bracket, $400,000 in annual income. And then some proposed changes to capital gains taxes are probably likely as well. So it wouldn't surprise us at all, for example, if capital gains were taxed as ordinary income above the $1 million threshold. So for individuals or households that have more than $1 million in income, capital gains are taxed as ordinary income as opposed to the long-term preferential rate that prevails right now. And possibly some other changes on stepped-up basis and some other items like that. But those are the areas we think are most likely to change on the personal income tax front. at least in the proposal that we'll get later this month on, again, some of those policies I was just talking about a moment ago. There could be some other changes proposed from the Biden administration, maybe on estate taxes, reverting those back to pre-2017 tax cuts, or maybe even all the way back to 2009 levels, maybe some changes to itemized deductions. But again, we think those are a lot less likely in the proposal later this month than the outlined ones to the top marginal rate and to capital gains taxes for the highest earners. So Jay, then I have a question for you. How do you think about all that? I mean, that's a lot to digest in terms of this couple $1 trillion in infrastructure we've already had proposed, maybe another $1 to $2 trillion on the spending side in addition to that still to come, higher corporate income taxes, some higher personal income taxes. How do you think about that through the lens of our economic outlook, and particularly on the heels of the nearly $2 trillion American Rescue Plan that we already had enacted just a few weeks ago?
Right. Well, so let's start with talking about that package that was enacted a few weeks ago. That has a big impact in the short term here. I mean, you think about a lot of that, it was checks to individuals, things that kind of get spent right off the bat. And that's why we have a very, very strong economic outlook for this year and going into next year as well. In terms of these new proposals that the president is talking about, that's it's not going to have the same sort of short-term effects. We're talking about infrastructure. It takes years to build that stuff out. And even if they pass a package tomorrow, the money wouldn't start getting spent right away. So we think in the short term, it has very limited sort of impacts. Further out in the longer term, these proposals, and particularly the ones with the taxes, could also have very long run sort of effects, but we really need to know some of the more details. You mentioned we don't know a lot of these details right now, and so we really do need to see some of those more details. So Mike, you recently wrote a paper about a lot of the details, at least in some of these other sorts of packages. Where can people find that report?
So if you'd like to read the report that Jay referenced, or read any of the reports that we put out on a regular basis, you can find that research at www.wellsfargo.com/economics. So again, that's wellsfargo.com/economics.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thank you all for joining us today. As we mentioned, there's still a lot of details we don't know yet, and as we find out what those details are and what the implications may be for the economy, we'll certainly be communicating them to you. So again, thank you very much for joining us today.